Thank you
Thank
so much.
you.
Okay, Anna.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Fourth Space podcast. Dramaturgical Ecologies is a 3-year research creation project of which Angelique Wilkie is principal investigator. Working at the intersection of dance dramaturgy and Black performance studies, this project is supported by an interdisciplinary team of 4 Concordia and 2 affiliate artist researcher assistants. This semester, Winter 2022, they are putting on a series of 5 moderated events aimed at provoking conversations that are themselves movements between disciplines, concepts, scholars, and practitioners in order to generate and destabilize dialogue and reflection on Black performance. We are very fortunate for this episode of the Fourth Space podcast to have invited members of DE, Dramaturgical Ecologies, Matthew-Robin Nye, Dana Dugan, Cadu Mello, and Vanessa Montesi to give us a behind-the-scenes look at their project and some of those upcoming events. So without further ado, I welcome you all in and pass the floor to you for introductions.
Great. Thank you very much, Anna and Doug and Fourth Space for having us here. My name is Matthew Nye. I am a PhD candidate here at Concordia University in the Interdisciplinary Humanities program. And I am joined by 3 of the 6 artist researcher scholars who are the research assistants for Angelique Wilkie's Dramaturgical Ecologies project. I will allow them each to introduce themselves. Cadu, do you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm Cadu Mello. I'm a PhD student at the Humanities Interdisciplinary Program, and also a collaborator in the Dramaturgical Ecologies group.
Vanessa?
And I am Vanessa Montesi. I'm a PhD candidate in comparative studies at the University of Lisbon, where I have just submitted my PhD thesis on theatrical dance as a form of intermediate translation. And I'm a research assistant at Dramaturgical Ecologies and also founding member of the research group Parte in Lisbon.
Thanks.
Okay, I guess that leaves me. Yes, thank you again for space. My name is Dana Dugan. I'm a performance-based artist scholar, PhD student at the HUMA program at Concordia. Also a member of the Dramaturgical Ecologies group. And yeah, I think that's it. I'm getting a phone call right now. Excuse me. Sorry about that.
So today,
yeah, I think that's pretty much it for me. I'm also American, a mother, you know, things like that. So
thanks, Dana. So today we are coming together to have an informal conversation about.
I can't hear Matthew.
Can Cadu or Vanessa? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
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 So that's your headphones, Dana. Today we're coming together to have an informal conversation about the Dramaturgical Ecologies research group. Dramaturgical Ecologies is a 2.5-year-old research project that is funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, the Fond de the FRQSC. We have recently been successful in Connections SHRC application to extend our research in a sort of ancillary project called Murmurations to the end of this year. That application was also supported by the Milieu Institute, the Center for Interdisciplinary Studies in Society and Culture, and Fourth Space has been a generous presenter of our work in our meetings coming together. in the Murmurations project, which is leading, which we're leading into with the ABCs of Dramaturgical Ecologies, which we'll talk about in a little bit. We are also being joined by a partner nonprofit organization, the 3 Ecologies Institute. Does one of you want to start off by introducing Angelique Wilkie and maybe the start of the Dramaturgical Ecologies project?
I can take a stab at it. So Angelique began this project because she was interested in looking at the embodied dramaturgy of the performer that's often not acknowledged, the specificity of an embodied dramaturgy of a performer within contemporary dance, because it's often not considered. And in her decisions about how she was going to go about this research, she chose herself just kind of out of convenience. So she became the object of study for the project. And in the process, you know, we had COVID, we had Black Lives Matter. As we began closer looking at this idea of the embodied dramaturgy of the performer, it became clear that Blackness was what some of her Blackness was something that became a central interest in our research, accompanied with the notion of dramaturgy, which ends up being the 2 pillars, foundational and conceptual pillars of the work that we're doing now. And then also in that process, the research creation aspect of it, or the primary part of it, was a work she did with Melanie Demers and her company Mayday, and the work was called Confession Publique, which premiered last year at La Chapelle. And so much of the work that we've done discursively has come out of the non-discursive work that was going on with Confession Publique. If I left something out, please somebody add.
So maybe I can ask you a follow-up question there, Dana. When you say much of the work that we're doing comes out of Confession Publique, can you sort of describe that a little bit for someone who's not familiar with our project, how research creation is working as a sort of a research council funded event here? What brings us together in relation to Confession Publique?
Well, in the research creation portion of this, there's the creative part, which is Confession Publique, which she did with Melanie Demers. And the research aspect of it was formed she had an interviewing process and ended up creating the group that we have here, plus others. And as she was going through the process in the creative research part of the development of Confession Publique, we would enter the process at different moments in the creative process. And in that, there would be questions about the process and, you know, in terms of how choices were made, how the dramaturgy that was going on for herself as the performer was influencing dramaturgies that were existing on the creation as a whole. And so over the course of that time, this has been how we've deepened our investigations on Blackness and dramaturgy. I don't know if that answered the question.
Yeah, maybe it's interesting to say that in Confession Publique, Angelique was both the dramaturge and the performer. So initially we were really looking at how her embodied dramaturgy as a performer would shift the creative process, and that we did that through a series of interesting interviews that we carried out because we couldn't meet in person, which ended up in an article that we published in Repertório, a Brazilian journal for performance studies, and then as we were looking at our embodied dramaturgy and then at the sociocultural inscriptions that bodies carry, we became more and more interested in this idea of how does Blackness come into relation and into friction with dance dramaturgy. I think that was interesting for us to delve in a little bit more deeply.
Yeah, I think I will add to what Vanessa is saying also. As we had our engagement with Confession Publique and around Confession Publique, Black studies, dance dramaturgy, slowly we started to dive into this idea of the bodies in the creative process, the dramaturgical body, some ideas around that became the focus of dramaturgical ecologies, where the bodies in a creative process, they cannot be separated from where they are situated in a creative process. So from that that emerging relation between Blackness, dramaturgy, questions around agency in the creative process, as we moved through Confession Publique, we came with a series of events, right? The ABCs of that somehow they try to activate a bit the ideas, the questions that we kind of produced as last year's engagement with the creative process of Angelique on Confession Publique was manifesting themselves. So we created this series of events, the ABCs of these, as a way to somehow activate the questions that we had by inviting a series of scholars and practitioners, where this distinction is very, it's actually not, it's an arbitrary distinction in the sense that the people that we are invited them somehow for them to share their living creative practices, also of course bringing their scholarship around dance dramaturgy, around Black studies, around diasporic studies, with a series of keywords that would be a sort of a kind of a thematics for the conversations, but are not per se concepts that we want our guests to define, but more like as little prompts, or those keywords would become like prompts to help to bring questions that relate to their practices, that relate to their researches, and also somehow we started trying to conceive an experimental staged conversation, or trying to ask what else a staged conversation can be. Because since we understood that in our research creation practices on dramaturgical ecologies, we have such a complexity of relations between fields of study, between Blackness, Black studies, dramaturgy, diasporic studies, in relation to creative processes, in relation to agency, and somehow bringing questions around that, we try to kind of experiment with the format of events that could bring those complexities. So like instead of inviting our guests to define or to answer what each of those keywords are, we don't have, let's say, a first step for that. The idea being that what those keywords might bring, how do they resonate in our guest practice, so we can think those across and together, given the specific differences of each of our guests' practices and studies.
Yeah, and these are all keywords that emerged out of our practice and out of our, 3 years of meeting, and things that became recurrent, some words that became recurrent in our practice, and that we can immerse ourselves a little bit in them. Yeah, I think it's going to be a beautiful encounter.
Yeah, and it's interesting also to mention that before the podcast, we just had our first event this past Monday, to the 24th, where we were having a conversation between Seika Boyd from the University of Toronto, that is a researcher on Black social dance that has a practice with archives, curatorial practices. She's also a choreographer of contemporary dance, in dialogue with Melanie Demer, who is the choreographer of Confession Publique, the piece that we were just talking about. Melanie is a choreographer. She's a multidisciplinary artist. And we invited them to somehow engage with those two keywords, relationality and body as archive, for example. And from that first invitation to talk about around those concepts, many other things emerged, that it's about their practices. Melanie as a choreographer, Seika as a curator, but always crossed by dance dramaturgy and Black studies, conversations around identity. So yeah, this was our first event, and then next month in February, we are having the second iteration. That maybe, would you like to talk a bit about it, Dana?
Oh, yeah, sure. Before I start, I just wanted to, and maybe this was mentioned, but I wasn't sure, but I think one of the intentions that we had in the planning for this is that that we kind of privileged practice a bit, or it was important for us to have a practitioner present that has an interest in scholarly research, or these kind of academic interests that we're part of, but it was important to honor that as that we are a research creation group. So every pairing, it seems that looking at the pairings, everybody has a creative practice within what they're doing in terms of performance or artistic creation. But just wanted to point that out. So I'm going to be moderating the next event. That's February 9th. That's going to be from 1 to 3 p.m. And the two presenters that we're going to have are Stephanie Martelly of the University of Sherbrooke and Funmi Adewale from, where is she from? Sorry, she's in the UK, but she also is a professor as well. Both are actually quite active creators. Stephanie, she is primarily, her practice is poetry, primarily in French as well. She is from, she's Haitian, and so a lot of her work revolves around narratives around and creation, or kind of she wouldn't use this, we had our first meeting, but there's an Afro-fabulation about the work that she does, sort of creating stories where she feels there might be gaps, or the limitations of representation of stories that she might want to see circulating. And then Funmi, who is Nigerian but lives in the UK, will also be joining. And one of her specific interests is in Afro-diasporic dramaturgies. She's a multimedia artist. She does come from dance, but she also works as an active dramaturg. And so the two keywords that we will be bouncing between are diaspora and praxis. And then, of course, as another umbrella is the two concepts of Blackness and dramaturgy, where I don't know if we said this before, but I think that one of the things that when we were discovering this idea of Blackness, that what Blackness was doing in dramaturgy or in the dramaturgical process and the creative process was how it was sort of becoming a lens and foregrounding certain things that had not been considered before, certain relations and yeah. So then the next event that we're going to have is April 7th. And do you want to talk about that, Vane, a little bit? Or I can.
And I will be moderating the event that we have after that. So it will be the third iteration. And that will happen on April the 7th from 2 to 4 p.m. Montreal time. And I'm very thrilled by that because I'm going to moderate to a scholar and an artist who are both began to work in the UK. Daniel McNeill then moved to Toronto, to Canada, but they both come from the UK, where I'm going to live soon. And I've lived for some time, so I feel that there's a connection already. And Daniel McNeill is a professor and Queen's National Scholar Chair in Black Studies at Queen's University. His work engages with history, diaspora studies, cultural studies, from which he explores the complexities of global Black communities in 20th and 21st century. And Seraphine 1369, previously known as Last Year's Interesting Negro, is the London-based artist and dancer Jamila Johnson-Small. Their choreographies work through questions of presence, visibility, responsibility, and pleasure. They build atmospheric landscapes that unfold the tensions and produce meaning by juxtaposing things in order to expand, situate, or even dismantle their identity and making theater out of that. And it's really interesting because the two keywords that I will be sharing and reflecting on are opacity and friction. And I think that their work is really, if I think about Seraphine's work, it's really about reclaiming a right to opacity. And if I think about Daniel McNeill's engagement with the term multiculturalism and the way it ends up normalizing, it's a normalizing gesture in the way it is used in policies. There's also their sort of way of preventing people from having the right to opacity, or a way of imposing a transparency, making something manageable. So I'm already like having a lot of ideas about things to ask, and I'm really thrilled by this conversation. I should also say that another thing that I found particularly interesting is the fact that in different ways, they both have worked by questioning, or mostly questioning and problematizing gazes. For Seraphine, she does problematize gazes that are imposed on her body in a lot of her works. And for Daniel, he did publish a book, Sex and Race in the Black Atlantic, that also talked about the way certain gazes were imposed on people of Black descent and how they were represented in media and even in performative, in the performative arts. So I think that is a wonderful pairing. And I'll be very happy to moderate that session. And Matthew.
Well, I will be moderating the last paired conversation between Nyla Kaneda, I'll be moderating the last conversation between Nyla Kaleda-May, who is a professor at the University of Toronto, a spoken word poet, playwright, and a performance scholar. And I'll be hosting a conversation between Nyla Kaleda-May and Dana Michelle, who is who's an interdisciplinary artist, dance artist, choreographer, who's a Concordia alumna. And the keywords that we'll be working on are embodiment and representation. At least that's how it's been posed right now. So in each of these conversations, these keywords are not meant to be objects to move towards in order to define by the end of the conversation. The idea is that they actually act as more sort of as gravity points. So if Blackness and dramaturgy are the operating or the operative and most major gravity points of dramaturgical ecologies, the keywords are meant to sort of guide a vocabulary of movement. Vocabulando is a word in Portuguese, which, as I understand it, thinks about language and concepts as on the move, and thinks about how to activate thinking with a form of embodiment and a form of movement, which is, quite appropriate to this program. In particular about this conversation, what I'm looking forward to is discussing between Dana and Nyla. I'm interested in talking about text and the sonic in their performance practices. I've had the pleasure of witnessing Dana Michel's work in the past, and I find that she uses sound in incredibly interesting, in a very interesting manner. The piece of hers that I most recently saw was called Cut Last Spring, and in it she has a microphone and she's making a sort of a clicking noise throughout a performance, a dance performance. And the way that she uses sound in that piece helps to orient and also dislodge regular signifiers, the signifiers that we understand emerge out of language and simple, quote unquote, simple movement practices. The sound disrupts that and adds a sort of a contrapuntal vector to the work. Similarly, Nyla Caleta-May recently released an article where she was talking about the practice of writing a play and how the engagement and the methodology that she was using as writing this play, as opposed to writing the words down first and then speaking them, there was a sort of as I understand it, a bit of a modulation between the making of sound, the embodiment of sound, even in words, that words embodiment with the text and the different, and by making the sound first with the body, or the words first with the body, as opposed to writing the words and then making them with the body, there was a different ordering, which led to a different sort of, well, both a different focus on the work, but also I'd almost call it a different para-ontological procedure in the making of a play. So the ABCs of dramaturgical ecologies are these series of conversations where we are building an embodied vocabulary, a vocabulando, that helps to sort of act as a bridge to the last stage of dramaturgical ecologies work. I should also mention that this portion of the of our research and creation activities is funded by the Aid to Research Related Events and Activities fund by the Office of the Vice President, Research and Graduate Studies, I believe it is. So this has also been, with this support, we've been able to offer transportation and accommodation. Under current circumstances, we're still waiting to be able to do that. For our guests to be able to have these meetings, at least in a hybrid format, ideally, where we're moderating, or at least one or two of the guests is in the fourth space at Concordia. So I'd like to, if possible, should we move to a different, a slightly different subject? Should we talk a little bit about the conversation that was had? The first conversation we had on Monday was hosted by Cadu. It was a brilliant conversation, I thought. And I came away with a lot a lot of curiosity, a sense of multiplicity. There was a sort of a shimmering in the building that was taking place in the conversation between Cadu and the two invited guests. And the keywords for that event, Cadu, could you, the keywords for that event were what?
That was body as archive and relationality. So yeah, it was a very beautiful conversation. Well, I think somehow we didn't think beforehand necessarily about an order for those keywords, right? But I think for me, like after the event, thinking back again about those gravitation points, as you referred to those keywords, Matthew, they made a lot of sense to start with. For example, relationality, right? Thinking about the practices that Melanie has, a choreographer, her creative practices in relation to the ways she talked and think around Black identities, that relation with dance choreography, dramaturgy, and also the amazing work that Teika Boye does of bringing Black social dance history through archives between the 1900s and the 1970s, showing those archives and doing this practice of inviting a community of artists to produce, to reverberate through those archives that she shows in the exhibition, has somehow an interesting resonance with this idea of relationality in creative process, and shows also how those dialogues will also be extremely important in the sense that all those iterations of events that we're having, they activate a huge community of artists and scholars that have themselves relations with other communities of artists, other communities of researchers that are around this thematic of Blackness and dramaturgy. So I'm really looking forward to all those iterations of events and what each of them are going to bring in terms of, the richness of our guests, and also the multitude of practices and peoples that they bring with,
And as you said in your, as you said in your introduction, Cadu, you said that that this multitude, this coming together, activates a community of people.
Mm-hmm.
And and of course, the question of I think it's worthwhile for us to go into the definitions of Blackness and of dramaturgy as the research group has been working with them. It's worth pointing out and identifying, I can say for myself, my whiteness in relation to the question of dramaturgy and Blackness. I think it's also worth it to think about how this chaos, as both Melanie and Seika identified in the question of relation, was so fundamental to the motoring of their own creative practices. They both had in many ways a sort of a spatial understanding of Blackness as I understood it. And it was a spatialized understanding that, as Mel said, was related to mess, failure, cravings, scars, traumas, identities in quest for freedom. And that her response there was, and I don't, so not to misquote her response there was specifically about her creative process. But it became very clear to me in this discussion that sort of that fugitivity that you identified in your question was also the fugitive practice of identities in renewal and in relation to one another.
Yeah, it's really beautiful and interesting how such a conversation like that bring along questions regarding identity as a not monolithic processes, and right, trauma, and even being a mother, being an artist mother. So like all those questions gravitating around, of course, they resonate and they put us in relation. They kind of provoke us to think, okay, what me, Cadu, as a person, Brazilian that today lives in Canada, how do I relate to that? How do I relate to Blackness? What is my relation with Blackness? But also, so many other relations regarding gender, regarding it's very rich, it's very complex, and we want to somehow, I think our process with Dramaturgical Ecologies has been to keep honoring those complexities and trying to put our relationalities, our positionalities to talk also.
And if I may give a bit of an introduction, sort of biographically, to Angelique, who is the principal investigator of this of Dramaturgical Ecologies, and for whom the central research creation activity Confession Publique was oriented around. Angelique was born in Jamaica, moved to Canada, I believe, as a teenager, and then spent 25 years really developing a practice in the context of European concert dance and dramaturgy. She's now a full professor here at Concordia University, and the Dramaturgical Ecologies project has also, in this very personal way, charted some personal explorations that she has been that she's been sharing with us, and that we've been a part of through these discussions. And so Dramaturgical Ecologies as a research group came together just before COVID, just before lockdown. So most of the conversations that we've all had together have been in this format on Zoom. Yeah. And so there's been a sort of a frontality and a flattening out, and yet a real sort of community building that's taken place with us through the Dramaturgical Ecologies project. Now, Angelique started off this project against the neutral canvas, and she was thinking about the role of the embodied dramaturgy of a performer in the dance creation process, in the performance and dance specifically creation process. And so one of the things that we talked about, or that you talked about on Monday, and Seika and Mel had a lot to talk about, was the concept of neutrality. As Seika said, this is a conversation that has been had many times in recent years and still has a lot, it's still quite necessary to continue to have that conversation. But this idea of neutrality is the idea that there is an unencumbered body that enters as the dancer into a performance creation context. And so specifically, we're looking at the dancer. Now, the premise that I understand this research project to have started with was Angelique's question, well, what about the inheritances of the individual that is walking into a room? I mean, at a very basic level, the person walking into the room might have turned their ankle on a crack in the sidewalk 20 minutes before. They might have experienced a different nutritional upbringing. They might have a different relation to their body based on some, being bullied as a kid or something to that effect. But what became really central to this project was, and as I said, this is the sort of autoethnographic portion of this research creation process, was the fact that as we know, at the same time that the world locked down because of COVID-19, there were multiple murders of unarmed Black people, particularly in the United States, but also here in Canada and elsewhere in the world. And so the question of the embodiment of Blackness, what in other contexts we might call a para-ontology of Blackness, which understands that Blackness is not just embodiment, it's a social configuration, it's an inheritance, and it's a way of relating, it's a form of sociality. All of these questions started to come to the foreground. And what was interesting to me when we looked at Mel and Seika in conversation on Monday was that both of them identified their community practices as central to their artistic practices, or their ways of relating to other people as central to their artistic practices. But they also identified motherhood and their experience of childhood. And this is something that was very significant to Angelique as well. So I think that there's a cross-section of gender and also sort of an idea of inheritance, in the sense that Angelique told us that, you know, in June 2020, she wasn't just thinking about herself and her embodiment, but she was thinking about her kids. And these are things that these are the things that challenge the concept of the neutral canvas. These are the things that when we're looking at an embodiment of a dramaturg, it's also the social relations that we bring in to the room with us.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And I think it's also something that the format that has been chosen for the podcast will help bringing in and having a more deeper discussion around, because the idea is not just to have people to come for one-off talk, but it's to maintain and to retain these connections and to keep them going throughout the series. So as I understand, and we'll come back again for the roundtable discussion, and there will be, like a sort of longer conversation like we've been having since 2020. We've been talking every week for like 2 hours, and that's something that has enabled us to deepen our understanding and get to this point of sharing this. And it's interesting also, I think, in the way that there are resonances. I can already foresee resonances in the talks, because we had Melanie and Seika discussing this idea of the body as archive. And then I look at Jamila Johnson-Small, and they use the idea of the body as an oracle, as an archive and an oracle. So I'm already like, you know, there's a kind of activation that goes on through these keywords that are chosen, and to what the people that have been invited are bringing in, and are like, you know, spinning around to other directions. And yeah, it's really brilliant. I think it will be. And yeah, I'm so curious to see how it unfolds.
Yeah, and this spinning around is, again, it's a theme that's starting to come up. In Dana Michelle's bio, she talks about a sort of, I believe it was sort of a centrifugal sort of creation process. When Mel was talking, she was talking about vectors of like a horizontal vector and a vertical vector of a creation process or a dancer's embodiment, in which there's awareness of what's taking place. And she, I think, actually put that on the vertical vector, and an awareness of an individual's own history and sort of future movements, to paraphrase. And when Angelique talks about dramaturgy and Blackness, we have this quote that we keep coming back to, where she goes, Blackness and dramaturgy and Blackness, what's happened? And there's a movement between these two things where we start to ask, what are dramaturgy and Blackness offering each other? And what, in that sort of centrifugal motion, in that chaos that Mel and Seika introduced at the beginning of their conversation, where's the fecundity there? Like, we know it's there. And, you know, there's a sort of a strategy of, you know, this is the object of this program is not to seek transparency. It's not to make clear empirical meaning of these engagements, which is part of the reason why we're really not looking for exact definitions in the keywords that we're using. We're hoping that they're generative and sort of add more to the project. I'm wondering if maybe we could also talk a little bit about how Okra and choreocratic ecologies is coming into this portion of our research process, and perhaps murmurations, the concept of murmurations, but where we're going with this work in the coming year.
How do we talk about Okra?
We're still trying to figure that out ourselves.
We're still trying to figure out, but basically, it was the image of the okra, or okra as a concept, or even more as a proposition, came from this challenging the challenges that are put when we want to somehow talk about things that carry such a complexity, and we are challenged by language. We are challenged by a way of representing the complexity of the questions and the ideas that we are bringing. So I don't know. There is a big challenge that okra is what? It's not a metaphor.
What is okra?
But what is okra?
Well, let's start. What is okra at its very base? What is the thing that we're calling okra? For those that don't know what okra is,
it's a vegetable,
mm-hmm.
and it's a vegetable that has its contradictions in the sense that it's unforgiving. There's people that love okra. There's people that don't like okra. I never saw like someone in the middle. And yes, it is a vegetable that its origins comes from Africa, from ancient Egypt, and through the forced diaspora accompanied the slave ship, and since then were cultivated in different parts of the Americas. And so yeah, there is this relation with a diasporic process, and that was somehow, that wasn't the starting point. That's not how it emerged. It emerged in the sense that my own curiosities with how are the other ways we can find to talk about our researches, to talk about our creative processes, and yeah, how to talk about it, how to present it otherwise, that is not by the frames of representation.
So one day, over a year ago, we were in a meeting and we were stuck. We were trying to share our practices together as researchers in order to understand each other a little bit more, understand our relations between our own practice and the project of Dramaturgical Ecologies. And Cadu brought a proposition. He brought a lure for us in the form of okra. He said, maybe we're stuck. I'm paraphrasing, and I hope I'm not misrepresenting you. Maybe we're stuck, and maybe what we need to do is think about okra. And so, you know, it was not, to repeat what you said, it was not initially it wasn't presented to us as a tool that was already formed, that could just sort of solve our problems and act as a metaphor for our diasporic relation to one another and our relation to diasporic Blackness, which is a key component of this project. it's definitely thinking Blackness and Black studies from the point of view of North America, but not only. We're thinking about Blackness. We're studying, a number of us are studying with Bayo Okomolafe, who is a Nigerian scholar living in India. We find that Edouard Glissant really motivates our works and helps us think the poetics of relation. And he's from Martinique. And as I said earlier, Angelique also has an experience of non-North American Blackness, or she has an experience of Blackness which is not simply North American, although it clearly is part of it, in European concert dance, in her upbringing in Jamaica. And so we started to think with Okra in order to find ways of relating to one another otherwise. Find ways of relating to diasporic identity and practices otherwise. And our hope, I think through what we are calling choreocratic ecologies, is to find other ways to relate to the project of dramaturgical ecologies. And also as we move dramaturgical ecologies in this sort of cellular expansion from Confession Publique, from this sort of absolute core of Angelique's research creation, semi-autobiographical project with Melanie, we start to sort of expand outwards. And so once the ABCs of DE have been completed, we have a couple of partnerships and conversations that we're hoping to produce in the second half of this year in particular. And they're under the name murmurations. And murmurations, does one of you have a definition for murmuration?
Isn't it the movement of flocks of birds as they move, and the way that they, form, converge together and then disperse and then come back? And I've been looking at a lot of them by chance, but I was in Rome and it was just like these flocks of birds moving and creating shapes and then going in all directions, coming. It was so amazing. But I think it's the idea of like converging with each other, each own singularity, and retain that, but also create shapes together and then move about.
And it's that exactly. It's we've talked about Glissant's concept of difference without separability is Denise
Ferreira da Silva.
Yeah, who's Afro-Brazilian, now living in Vancouver, I believe. But we came to the idea of murmuration, or the key word of murmuration through Fred Moten. He says that murmuration is a cool word because it bears the trace of the sound. So murmuration, it is beautiful when you watch those movements, but it's even more beautiful when you hear them. The internal difference of the swarm is absolute wealth. And so that key thing, that internal difference of the swarm is absolute wealth, to me really connects to the choreocratic and to Okra, because as we've talked about the consistency of okra as a foodstuff, it's a cellular vegetable in the sense that there are different sort of seed cells, but also in different cooking techniques. Dana, you talked about the use of okra in making roux.
The roux specifically referring to food that comes from New Orleans or Louisiana, the state of Louisiana, and the way okra is used in so many dishes. And it is a lot of people are repulsed by this sliminess, but it is the sliminess that creates the foundation and the roux for the basis of the several dishes that they have, like gumbo and red beans and rice, even shrimp etouffee. But I think that that's part of the draw of what the okra does functionally as a way to enter into the project, is that part of the idea of exploring through okra is that we have such a diverse set of practices amongst us all. And we've been, over the course of this project, we've been questioning and exploring what it is that our collective methodology or practice is that we work with. And so it's a bit like we're, through the Okra as an intercessor, a partial intercessor, that we're creating a roux for ourselves. And we still have yet to explore this like fully. So sometimes I feel like, how do we explain what we haven't really done yet? But this is the lure, like Matthew said. And we'll be working at this, at the 3 Ecologies site as a research creation with our group specifically to explore more. So there'll be more on choreocratic, after that.
Mm-hmm. And we're
Can I
also...
add something?
Yes, May.
I want to offer you this because you talk about the sound of murmuration. Now, murmurare in Italian is to whisper. So my visceral connection when you write murmuration, I have a choir of whispering people. This is for me the sound of murmuration is to whisper. And
That's really
maybe
beautiful.
we should, before we stop this, I think but all of you as well, it's important to acknowledge the work and in the thinking process of Hailey Bird, Elina Shalom, and Christian Scott, in all the thinking process that led to the ABCs of the E and to what we're presenting today from March 2020 onwards. It's been great allies and friends and colleagues.
Yeah, it's true. In order to not make too much of a murmuration in the podcast recording, we've had to reduce our numbers as research assistants so that we can theoretically speak clearly. But there is in the group a certain murmuration that comes from its diversity of voices. So Christian Scott, Melina Cialom, and Hailey Baird have also been extremely instrumental in Dramaturgical Ecologies and its work so far.
With their different practices of Melina choreology, Christian Scott urbanism, and Hailey anthropology. So it's an ethnography.
So our next meeting is on February 9th. It'll be hosted by Dana Dugan. And it will be here at Fourth Space.
We hope that this time it will be in person, if COVID allows.
Oh, we hope so. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Anna and Doug, for having us in Fourth Space. It was a great conversation.
Yes, thank you for this.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Douglas.
Thank you.
You're muted if you're speaking, Anna.
Very much enjoying and commenting on this conversation. So. Yeah, that's right. Anyhow, as I say, we will be listening to these words once again, doing some gentle, caring edit work, and re-releasing this conversation as a podcast for your listening pleasures. So thank you so much for the roundtable. Thanks for coming together in this way. We do have fingers firmly crossed for being back in the space all together very soon. And we look forward to either way hosting you again in early February. So thanks, everyone. We're going to close up the webinar now. Have a wonderful afternoon. Cheers.
Thank you. Have a great afternoon,
Thank you for having
everybody.
us.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.